Hi everyone, you're watching Fix-A-Day and thank you for joining me. So behind me is a 2012 Chevy Cruze. I'm going to be replacing the head gasket on it today, and I'm going to show every step of the process to sort of make it as easy to follow along as possible. So this is going to be a very straightforward video, clear and concise and to the point, so let's get right into it. This video utilizes YouTube's chaptering feature. See the description or the pinned comment for quick links to each section of this video. The tools that you'll need for this, they're very basic. I think the only specialty ones are the kit and these inverted Torx sockets. So starting from the top, you will need some sort of drivers for all of these. So you can make your pick. You can use 1/2 inch with adapters, you can use 3/8, you can use 1/4 inch. Various adapters, swivels, extensions, whatever you want to make it work, but this is the bare minimum of what I used. So a T30, a T45, and a 255 Torx, an E10, 12, 14, and 18 E-Torx or inverted Torx sockets, a 7, 10, 13, 15, 17, and 24 millimeter sockets. I did use a combination of deep and shallow for the 15 millimeter. 2 wrenches, 22 to hold the cams, 17 if you're replacing the coolant lines to the turbo, otherwise you don't need this. A pick, that's just mostly for hoses and electrical connectors, and a hammer, just various uses. You'll need a compressed air, a blowgun of some sort, or whatever you can make work. You do have to clean out the head bolt holes of all oil and coolant, so you will need to find some way to clean that out. An inspection mirror, this is going to be for the timing chain tensioner, just so you can see to get the lock pin in place. A pair of pliers for hose clamps, a inch-pound torque wrench, and a foot-pound torque wrench. For shop materials or consumables, you will need some RTV for the timing cover and valve cover surfaces. You'll need, this is optional, but I'd recommend some silicone paste or other lubricant for hoses and O-rings, anti-seize for the exhaust and catalytic converter studs, and some brake parts cleaner to clean things and to degrease things in preparation for using the RTV sealant. And a flashlight if you need it. I did. So there's your basic tools. As far as specialty tools go, this is a GM Ecotech, I think 1.0 and 1.4 timing chain kit. I got this off Amazon. It was about 30 bucks, so very inexpensive. And the cool part is it even comes with a secondary set of instructions on how to set the timing for each engine. So that's very handy. Well, I guess you can see here, this is a list of the applicable engines. So you absolutely have to have this. There's no other way around it because it sets the phasers for the camshafts. It locks the camshafts in position and the crankshaft in position. It also comes with a tool for the timing chain tensioner. I started off using a drill bit, but this is definitely the way to go here. And I will have a link for this in the description. Okay, first step, remove the negative battery terminal. Next, air cleaner assembly and intake duct. You'll need a 7 millimeter. On the connector for the mass airflow sensor, there's a small safety tab. You just pull that back, and then you can remove the connector. There's a small pipe on the bottom that also needs to be removed. Right there. And then the air cleaner simply unclips out of place. Next step is to remove the PCV pipe, which is this tube here that goes back to the intake. There's a small vacuum line here, a clip here, and one on the intake as well. So the vacuum line, it comes off a little nipple on the turbo. Just like that. And now for the big hose, You have to squeeze the two marks where your fingers go and wiggle it off. Just like that. For the valve cover side, there's a little metal clip that you need to pull back, and it should lock in place. Just like that. And then it comes straight up. So for the small vacuum line, I'm not going to be able to film removal, but I'll show you where it is. There's a small vacuum solenoid. You can see it in the center of the screen there. And if you look at the small vacuum line here, trace it down, that's where it connects. So you just pop that off. Next step is to remove the intake. So I'll start off by removing this cover. Just lift straight off. And then on the back side, this is also going to be a little hard to film, but there's one bolt on the end, two in the right center, two in the left center, and then one on the left side. And there's also a brace that you have to get from the bottom, and I will show that. Now, since we're going to need some extra slack in the harness to get it away from the head, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the oxygen sensor here. There's a little tab that needs to be lifted up right here, just like that. And as you lift it up, the connector will pull out, just like that. Next is going to be the the manifold pressure sensor. I believe that's what this is. It just has a regular tab and just unclips. I'm gonna have to get a little creative to get that tab to release. There it goes. Now for the coil pack connector, it also has a safety tab like the mass airflow. You just pull it out and then press the release tab and it slides off. Now in this harness bundle, or this harness branch, there's two more wires. One is one of the coolant temperature sensors right here. The other is a ground on the head right here. There's that one. Now we'll go ahead and loosen the charge pipe so that we can get to the ground. It is a 7mm. Okay. For the ground, now you'll need the E12 bit. So while I'm in this area, I'm also going to go ahead and unbolt this coolant outlet. It has 3 bolts that are also E12. Unbolting the outlet allows you to keep all the hoses intact, so it saves you a little bit of work and a little bit of time. Obviously you want to have a drain pan now as well. Alright, now that's loose. There's the gasket for it. Now it's time to go ahead and unbolt the intake before the harness gets in the way. So I'm going to briefly show you the bolts. You see in the center of the screen there's one on the end. There's 2 on the left center, 2 on the right center, and then 1 on the very far end. So we'll go ahead and get those loose. You'll once again need the E12 for this. So be mindful of this driver's side center top bolt. There's a ground wire on it, so be careful it doesn't get twisted up. Alright, now that those are all loose, let's go ahead and pull the intake back. Now we're going to unclip the harness to get a little more slack. Now over here on the driver's side, since the harness comes along here, all these do need to be disconnected. I'm not going to completely disconnect this whole harness because you don't really need that completely out of the way, but you do need a little bit more slack to get like the water pump and the head off. So I'm going to disconnect the thermostat here. There's just a little push tab on the side right there, and then we're going to do the cam position sensors. They have a safety lock. If you can see this little gray tab here, you have to slide it back just like all the others, and then you can press the tab and slide it right off like that. Now we're at the front of the engine, and we're going to go ahead and disconnect the camshaft. I think they're phasers or synchronizers, something like that. They control the position of the cam. So they do have safety locks like all the other safety connectors. And there's a tab you can push and it disconnects. You have one for the intake and the exhaust. And finally, the intake cam position sensor. Also a safety style connector. So now that we have a little more harness, let's go ahead and see if we can get the intake a little further back. Oh yeah, that is much better. Now there is that support brace that I was telling you about that usually goes on the back side of the intake to support the back of it. This engine has been swapped before and whoever did it didn't put that back, so I can't show you how to remove that, but it is somewhere back there, probably 2 bolts. Next up is the turbocharger. First is to get the heat shield off with an E12 bit. It's got 3 bolts, 2 on the top and 1 in the bottom. Now that the turbo is exposed, we'll need to remove the oil feed line, which is this wrapped silver line here. You'll need the E12 bit for this side and a T45 bit for this side. Now you can go ahead and remove the line. It slides out of the oil cooler here, or the oil filter housing, and then you can just rotate it out like this. Make sure that both the washers come with the banjo bolt. Plug the oil supply to the turbo, just so you don't get anything in there. So that would be very bad. Now we'll go ahead and disconnect one of the coolant lines. These aren't the original clamps. Somebody put these on here, but they're 1/4 inch. There is a hold down bracket right here on the that needs to be removed, and it is an E10. Okay, so the next coolant line is actually hard to get to. You'll need a 17mm deep well and a 6-inch extension. Now, if you look in the center of the screen, you'll see the chrome where the socket's already on it. The bolt is right there. It's the same style fitting that was used for the oil line. It's a banjo fitting. So you'll need to get your extension on there first, and then you can get it loose. Don't forget to move your drain pan. Now there's a boost control solenoid that needs disconnected on the inlet side of the turbo. It's got a little metal bail that you need to disconnect to slip off of there. This. And then it just slides straight down. So now on the exhaust outlet side, there's a V-band clamp that needs removed. You'll need a 13mm for this. So it looks like mine's actually broken. It shouldn't come off like that. It should stay together. We'll go ahead and remove the charge pipe or the turbo discharge hose, 7mm. Alright, so now we're under the car, and this is the bottom of the catalytic converter where the downpipe connects. You do have to remove the catalytic converter, so we'll go ahead and get these nuts loose. You'll need a 13mm for those, and a 10mm for the reinforcement brace. So this one's been replaced before, so it's got a nut and a bolt. Now for the reinforcement brace. Alright, so there's one more reinforcement brace for the catalytic converter. It's that little stud right there. You'll need your 13mm for this. There's also a washer with this, so make sure you don't lose it. Now we're finally ready to remove the cat. It does have to go out through the bottom, however, so just be mindful of that. There it is. Now that everything is disconnected from the turbo, it's time to remove the turbo itself. You'll need your 10mm for this. So there's a coolant line coming off the thermostat housing here that needs to be removed to get this last nut off of the turbo. So you probably have a spring clamp or a screw clamp. In my case, it's a 5/16. I just need to disconnect this hose and get it out of the way. I did forget to mention the oil drain tube. It's easier to get from the bottom, but if you're careful, you can get it from the top. It has a little clip, much like the electrical connectors, and it just slides out of the block. There it is. So here's the drain line that I was talking about. You can see it's just got a little clip that you need to pry out of the way. So there's actually some of this missing. They're supposed to stick out about this far with O-rings on it. So I'll have to replace this tube and get the broken bits out of the block. So our next step here is we have to remove the water pump pulley to remove some bolts behind it. So we're going to have to remove the engine mount to do that. And this means we're going to have to put a jack under the engine to support it. So let's do that. Alright, I got a jack under it now, so you'll need a 15mm to get these loose. Alright, for this engine mount bracket, you'll also need a 15mm, but a shallow, and there's 3 bolts. So before we take the belt off, we want to go ahead and try to get these pulley bolts loose. You'll need an E12 for these. Now, sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't, just depending on how tight they are, but you can see that one came loose, that one, and that one. Now we can remove the belt. This is going to be an E14. You'll put it on the tensioner bolt right here, and you'll push down to release the tension, and then you can slip the belt off. Now we can go ahead and get that pulley the rest of the way off. So now the pulley's out of the way, we need to get this heater hose off, and you should have a spring clamp, but mine is a screw clamp, so I have an 8mm or a 5/16. And if you see your rubber really squishy like this, that's because it's swelled up due to oil contamination. They're not oil resistant, and so if oil ever comes into contact with them, it'll react like this. So this will have to be replaced. Moving the coil packs, and for this you'll need a T30 Torx. Now onto the valve cover. You want to go ahead and remove the dipstick, and you'll need an E12 Torx for the bolts. Now we're ready to go ahead and get this plug out for the tensioner. It's a T45. Uh-oh. It's trying to round off. Oh man. Well, I don't know who put that back in, but they did not tighten it properly, so I'm gonna try to go up a size and hammer it in. Well, so I wedged the T47 in there, bottomed it out, and it just rounded the teeth off of that one too. So I'm gonna have to get creative here. All right, I took a hammer and chisel to it, and that just got it. All it is a plug. It doesn't even need to be tight. So it just has a copper washer that seals it. And there's the chisel mark there, but that did the trick. So I'm gonna need a new one of these too. Okay, so we'll have to put the engine at top dead center before we can take slack off of the tensioner. You'll need an E18 socket for this, and that's just to turn the crank. And it's very simple on how to do this. So you'll look at the intake and exhaust cams, and the lobes for them, they'll be pointing this way for the exhaust, that way for the intake. All right, for this next part, you're gonna need a 22mm wrench. Turn the cam, the intake cam, clockwise here, and what that does is it loads the tensioner by pulling on the chain. So it should retract, and we should be able to fit a pin in here. Okay, so I ended up using a 2mm Allen wrench, and I know that that's kind of impossible to see back in there. I can't even see it with my eyes. I had to use a mirror. But if you hold tension and kind of twist that as you push it in, you'll feel the resistance, and then it'll just slip right in. So now, if you take tension off of this, you can see the chain's now slack. So that's what you wanted. Now that the chain's loose, we need to go ahead and remove the top guide. You'll need your E10 bit for this. There's 2 bolts. Okay, so now we're going to remove the timing cover bolts that bolt into the head. There's 8 of them. There's 3 on this side, there's 3 through the water pump, and there's 2 on this side. Now you can get these with leaving the position sensors in place, but just to be safe, I'm going to remove them because I don't want to break those. You'll need the E10 socket for this. Okay, now we'll remove the 3 on the intake side, 2 on the exhaust side, and the 3 through the water pump. There's 2 on the top, it's the left one, or on the intake side. There's 1 right here by the pulley, where the pulley goes. And the last one is below where the thermostat goes, right here. Keep track of the bolts that come out of the water pump because they are different lengths than the ones for the timing cover. So now we'll go ahead and remove these position actuators. That's a E10 bit. And these just slide right out. That one's new, so it came out a little easier. So now it's time to remove the sprocket bolts. You'll need to hold each cam with the wrench while you turn it with a socket. You'll need a 24mm socket. Pull the exciter wheels out as well. So now that those are out, the cam sprockets just slide off the cam, so you can take them off and just lay them in the timing cover. Like so. I'm going to take some zip ties though and hold them to the cover because I don't want them to fall out or get in my way somehow. Alright, so here's the big moment. We're finally ready to remove the head bolts and remove the head. So there's 12 head bolts. You want to start in a spiral pattern, working your way inward. And just for a special note, these are not reusable, they are torque to yield, so you do have to get a new set of bolts. Alright, so when you lift the head, you'll have to come up with this side first, slide it, and then lift. I'm hung on a gasket. Actually, that's not a gasket. Okay, so learn from my mistake here. The zip ties that I had were actually putting tension on the chain, which was pushing the tensioner, or sorry, the tensioning guide into the tensioner, which was making a catch on that guide. The guide is supposed to stay with the timing cover. The tensioner is supposed to stay with the head. So they were conflicting. Here's a better look at what I was talking about with the tensioner. You just need like a 2, maybe 2.5 millimeter drill bit or other kind of pin to stick in there to hold that plunger back. You can see it's clean here where the sealing surface is clean. The whole bottom half of this head is clean because it's the intake side, it's normally cooler. And you come up to the exhaust side and you can see a lot of the darkness or the blackness from the combustion gases escaping. Okay, so I called the machine shop on getting this resurfaced and cleaned just because the crud that's in the cooling system passages. They said it would be $175 if I leave it as is with the cam, brackets, accessories like the tensioner, things like that, or $125 if I strip all those when I bring it to them. So that's what I'm gonna do. And for reference, I paid about $130 about 10 years ago to have a head resurfaced, so I think that that's a very fair price. You'll need the E10 socket for these small ones, like the tensioner and the cam caps. E12 for the brackets. So now we're going to remove all the lifters. That was another component. They said that you could leave the valves, the valve springs, and the seals and everything. That would be fine. And also, you should keep all these in their respective locations so that they don't get mixed up. So be mindful of that. Okay, just like that, it's ready to go. Alright, just kidding. One last thing before it goes is the spark plugs. I don't know why I forgot that. It's a 5/8. Now it's ready. Alright, so while the head's at the machine shop, I do want to go ahead and do this oil cooler reseal. This is another common issue on these cars. You can see the wetness right here. The gasket between the oil filter housing and the cooler leaks. Like they dry out and they get really hard over time. Same thing with the gaskets for the oil cooler housing as well. So you have to remove this to change these gaskets, so let's get to that. Start off by removing this tube mount. Next, move on to the hose. Now disconnect the oil pressure switch. Now we use the E12 to remove the 3 bolts that mount the oil filter housing to the block. So back on the workbench now. Again, you don't have to do this to just do the head gasket, but it is highly recommended, though. We're already there. So you can slip this tube straight out. So you'll need your T30 for this. There's 4 bolts that hold the oil cooler to the oil filter housing. Now here's a quick look at the main gasket for this. And what these do over time is they just get really hard and brittle. So this one is very hard. And so here it is, closer look. You can see, it's not very rubbery anymore. So that's why this is a common issue on these. Alright, so I got the block all prepped. This is cast iron, so I just used a razor blade and scraped it really good. And on the corners of this gasket, I also cleaned and degreased really well because I'm going to have to put some RTV in there. So I'm going to go ahead and get the remainder of the turbo drain line out and then clean the oil filter housing base up, and we should be ready to go back together. So I'm using a compound angled pick for this. Just be careful not to scratch the block. There it is. Alright, so the gasket kit for the oil cooler actually comes with all the gaskets that you'll need, including the turbo coolant lines, oil lines, and the catalytic converter gasket. So I kind of think that you can actually do this without removing the exhaust manifold and turbo, but at the very minimum it looks like you'll need to remove the catalytic converter and the drain tube because there's a new drain tube gasket in here. But here's the Dorman kit for this, or Dorman part number for this. So let's get it installed. And those got torqued to 71 inch-pounds. On these O-rings, you definitely want to lubricate them with something. The best thing you can use for this is a little bit of oil, some grease, or some silicone paste like I have here. But along with the O-ring, you want to lubricate the hole that it goes in as well. These bolts get torqued to 15 foot-pounds or 180 inch-pounds. Now we switch to the E10. We're going to install the coolant inlet tube, and this gets torqued to 71 inch-pounds. So here's a look at the cylinder head back from the machine shop. They didn't have anything noteworthy, and they also didn't tell me that how far it was warped. I asked them to write it down. They said that they would. And then I got there and they just said, well, yeah, it was less than 10 thousandths. So, yeah, I don't know how warped it really was, but I'm a little concerned about the surface finish on it because you can tell all they did was fly cut it. So you can actually feel some of the roughness with your fingernail. And, you know, these engines being prone to head gasket failure, I told them up front what this came off of and they knew that. So maybe it's okay. I don't have a surface finish gauge or a way to measure that and quantify how rough it is, but I'm gonna have to just go on a leap of faith for what they did, so hopefully it turns out good. So since the head's already flipped up, I'm gonna start off with putting the tensioner back. You'll need the E10 for this. It gets torqued to 71 inch-pounds. Reinstall spark plugs. These get torqued to 18 foot-pounds. Now we're gonna do the lifters, the rockers, and camshafts. Since this is all clean, you do want to put some pre-lube on it or some engine oil. So now go ahead and put a little bit of oil on the bearing surfaces. Don't forget, if you're doing this on a table or something, that whatever oil spills into this area is going to come out the bottom. So be mindful of that. Now it's time to put the cap bolts back on, or the caps and bolts back on. These are going to be torqued to 71 inch-pounds. And you'll use the E10 bit for this. You'll start in the center, work your way out. So on the ends of the head here, you'll want to go ahead and clean this off, because although the machine shop cleaned it, silicone's actually pretty hard to remove with just standard pressure washing. So make sure that these are all clean. These faces need to be very clean. Also on these edges, go ahead and degrease them as well, because that's where the R2V is going to stick. So I just wanted to point out this detail here that I did. I put a punch wedged in between the cam gear and the timing cover to hold this chain guide back, because if you can see back in here, that hole is where the pin that you stuck in the tensioner has to pass through. So if this tensioner guide is laying over that hole, it's going to cause some issues, so make sure that that's up out of the way. So now I'm ready to put the head gasket on. I'm going to go ahead and apply silicone to these two corners here, and then lay the head gasket on it, and then put more silicone on top of that. So both sides of the head gasket have silicone. Just need a thin little layer there. Not a whole lot. Obviously, anywhere that silicone goes needs to be degreased very well. And also for this coolant passage right here and these two bolt holes, I'm going to put just a very, very thin layer over those. The service manual has a weird replacement gasket for just this top half, but obviously I'm reusing it, so this probably isn't recommended, but the rubber is still very supple on this gasket, so I don't see much harm in it. So here's the head gasket. It says which side is top. And one other important factor here is to make sure that the dowel pins are in place. That's these little pins that stick up, because those align the head and the head gasket, and they are very important. Alright, now another very thin layer of silicone. Just like that. Alright, we're ready for the head. So the dowel pin slots in the head are actually slotted. I should have mentioned this first. But once you set the head down, you'll have a little bit of a gap right here, so that's why I pushed it this way, is to help close that gap up. Obviously, another thing I didn't mention that's very important, make sure that your cams are back in the top dead center position that we removed them in. Same thing with the crankshaft. That way the valves don't interfere with anything. So next step after getting the head set down is reinstall the 3 timing cover bolts that we removed that go through the water pump. Now one of them is longer than the other 2. That one goes in the left bottom, right here. These get torqued to 71 inch-pounds. And you'll use the E10 socket for this. Alright, so now go ahead and take your head bolts, your new head bolts, don't reuse the old ones. Install them, run them all the way down, and then torque them as a first pass to 26 foot-pounds. You're going to start from the center and spiral outwards. And you go back to the E12 for these. Next step, rotate them 180 degrees. Do it in the same order as you did before, starting from the center and spiraling outward. I'm only going to show you one, and you should really use a dial gauge for this, but I'm just going to use the wrench since there's enough space in the engine bay to do all these. So here we go. Just like that. All right, so now that that's done, we need to loosen the 3 bolts that we just installed, or that we just tightened up here, and then install the 5 remaining ones back in the locations I'll show. And then they'll get torqued to 71 inch-pounds. All right, so I just loosened those 3 bolts. Putting these back in, you have one in the center, left, top left, bottom left, and over here where the cam sensor was, you have 2 right there. And again, this is an E10, torqued to 71 inch-pounds. All right, so it's time to reinstall the camshaft bolts, which is actually an oil control valve as well. These are torque to yield and not reusable. The part number that I chose, VVT 412, and this is from O'Reilly's, it's standard motor products. There's also a Dorman version, but you know, looking at them, I looked at both of them hand in hand. The standard looks to be better quality, so I went with the standard. Don't forget the exciter wheels as well. There we go. Alright. I'm actually going to soak this in oil before I put it in because it doesn't appear to have any. So once you get this threaded in all the way, go ahead and bottom it out, but keep it loose so that you can still rotate this wheel. Now we're going to set the position of the camshafts. So you're going to take your 22mm wrench and the camshaft position tool or locking tool, and you'll just, sorry if you can't see that, rotate each camshaft until the tool slides into place. This tool doesn't actually fit. Oh, it does. It's just really tight. So that was a little harder than it should have been, but they're locked in place now. And I've already removed the lower shield that's under here. There's three 8mm headed bolts that you need to remove. And then on the crankshaft, I rotated it until this hole is in line with this little line at the end of my finger here. So it should be in a straight line right there. So the next step, under the AC compressor is this plug. It's a T55. So this is where you're going to use your T55 to remove the plug so that we can insert the timing tool to lock the crankshaft. Okay, so once that pin is in, that's about, you can see that's about how far it's going to go in. And you'll feel it slide in as you're turning the crankshaft. It'll just drop in and the crankshaft will be locked. I have a big special note, however, and I kind of remembered this from a long time ago. The crankshaft pulley can be installed 180 degrees off. And so I don't know if you caught that in the video, but the piston was at top dead center, but the pulley, you can see the hole is right here. So I thought maybe I was just confused and maybe top dead center is down. Maybe it references cylinders 2 and 3. But no, it's actually that the crank pulley is in fact 180 degrees off. So if your crankshaft is the same, i.e. when you get the head off and the piston's at top dead center, but your hole in the crank pulley is over here, then that is your top dead center. If you try to put this tool in with it 180 degrees the other way, it won't ever lock in. It feels like it'll slip in about this depth, maybe a little bit further, but you can still rotate the crank freely. So be very careful with this because you can cause serious damage if you do this wrong. So once the tool goes in, you'll feel the crankshaft lock. Like it's a unmistakable feeling. It'll be very engaged. All right, so I wanted to show how it feels when you have it in the right spot. So here's the tool. It's at top dead center. I'm offsetting the crank, putting pressure on the tool and rotating the crank. You'll feel it slip in that much. And now I'm going to do it from the opposite direction, just like that. And then the crank has a little bit of movement, and this is how much the tool moves as well. So this is where you know that it is locked in place. And my recommendation is to set it somewhere in the middle of that play, in the middle of that movement. All right, so the next step is to install the chain tensioner. This tool here. In my case, it was a 4 and 5 millimeter. All right, so before you slide this in, make sure that the gear or the little cog in there is at its lowest position, and give a little turn on the intake cam toward the cab, and then lift the chain up, just like that. And then go ahead and run your bolts down by hand. Push it towards the intake cam as you tighten it. They don't have to be super tight, just snug. Alright, now push up and toward the cab on that little keeper and turn the intake cam as you push. And that'll get tension on the chain. And then once you're holding it up, go ahead and lock it in place. Just like that. The chain should be tight on this end. Next up is the phaser positioning tool. Now this can go several ways, so this is a little tricky, but if you look at this wheel, there's two large flanges, a blank, and a large flange. Or sorry, you can see there's a large flange, blank, and large flange. It's not like that anywhere else on the intake cam. So the pin on the tool is going to go between the two large flanges. So it'll be roughly in that position. For the exhaust cam, look for the single tang like this here. You see there's there's one there, but it's next to a large flange. But just find the single lone tang like this, and it's going to go to the left like that, pointing towards the tensioning tool that we just installed, and it will set against the left side of this tab of the tool. So setting it in, rotate that phaser just like that. That's how this goes on. And go ahead and snug these bolts down. Now we can finally tighten the cam bolts. So they go in 2 stages, just like the head bolts. The first stage is 37 foot-pounds, and then after that you go an additional 60 degrees. Make sure that you hold the cam with the wrench. Don't rely on the tools to hold the cam for you. Now I don't have an angle gauge like I said, so I'm going to use an angle finder on my phone to find 60 degrees. This is my creation in case you're wondering what that looks like. So you can kind of set it where you want, double tap to save that angle, and then as you rotate you can get what you need. I guess you can't really see that, but so yeah. So now that those are torqued, we can go ahead and remove all the timing tools. We're going to replace this tensioner with the original guide that we removed. These bolts get torqued to 71 inch-pounds. Alright, now that the top guide's in, it's time to remove our keeper for the tensioner. So you do have to preload the tensioner a little bit to get the plunger to go back in, so I just pull up on the chain a little bit while I'm pulling the pin out, and then release. So there's the pin. And now you can go ahead and reinstall the plug on the timing cover. Now that the chain tension is set, all the timing tools are removed, and the timing is set on it, go ahead and rotate the engine around 2 full revolutions, and then reinstall the timing tools to verify that the timing is in the correct position. They should go back into place. If they do, then good job, you're done. The top tensioner plug gets torqued to 30 foot-pounds, and the bottom guide pin tool hole that we removed, the plug on the side of the engine, that gets torqued to 30 foot-pounds as well. Alright, next to go on is these camshaft actuators. They get torqued to 71 inch-pounds each. Next is both camshaft position sensors. They also get torqued to 71 inch-pounds. Now it's time for the valve cover. All the bolts for that get torqued to 71 inch-pounds. And don't forget to degrease these areas here and apply a little bit of RTV. Make sure there's no oil on the head or the valve cover gasket. Next on the list is going to be the intake. Those get torqued to 15 foot-pounds or 180 inch-pounds. So the main reason I wanted to go ahead and get the intake on is because to do this hose repair and replace this end of this hose, I've got a piece of 3/4 inch hose and a mender, but I needed it to be at the right height so I know how much I can cut off of it. I want to get as much of this off as I can, so there's a mount on the intake that this mounts to, so that's why I did that. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut this hose and splice it with the new piece. Alright, so I got that fixed. Now it's time to get the water pump pulley on. These also get torqued to 15 foot-pounds or 180 inch-pounds. Now it's time to reinstall the belt. You'll need the E14 for this one. Next is the engine mount bracket. You'll need your 15mm for this, and these get torqued to 50 foot-pounds. Now for the engine mount, 15mm head, torque all of them to 46 foot-pounds. Alright, so now it's for the turbo install. I went ahead and got an all steel line. Here's the part number for it. And I did go with a new turbo, but I went with a cheap eBay turbo. So I don't know if I'm better off with a cheap eBay one or the really old worn out one that I had, but either way we're gonna take our chances here, so wish me luck on it. Alright, so I'm gonna cover the turbo install really fast. So when you set it in, make sure to guide the drain tube into the block first and guide it until it snaps into place. Don't use the turbo to push it down. Then I went ahead and tightened all the mounting nuts to get it firmly secured. Then I went to the back coolant line, the one that's really hard to get to with the banjo fitting. I tightened it, it screws into the block. Then I went to the next coolant line, which was this one right here. It connects into the oil filter housing. Then I installed the oil feed line. It snakes behind the manifold, and then you can feed the banjo bolt through it. And then you need to connect the oil pressure switch here and this heater hose here as well, this little elbow. Next up is doing this coolant outlet. Alright, so go ahead and put the coolant outlet back on. These get torqued to 71 inch-pounds. Now I'm going to reinstall the charge air cooler pipe. Alright, so I'm switching gears a little bit. We're going back to the exhaust. Go ahead and connect the turbo discharge hose, and then we're going to move on to installing the catalytic converter. Okay, for the cat, what I recommend is lift it up into place and get the V-band clamp onto it. Get the faces mated together and loosely install the V-band clamp. Just finger tight or hand tight on the bolt should be good. Then, if you remember the nut that goes to the side of the block for one of the reinforcement brackets, install that next. And what that does is it positions the cat at the right angle. So once it's at the right angle and that first bracket's tight, you can go ahead and do a final torque on the V-band clamp. Now what I did is I took a hammer and I tapped around the clamp in between tightening, because what that does is it allows an even tightening, because otherwise it builds up friction in this back half or the front half and it doesn't tighten it correctly. So tap it, tighten it, tap it, tighten it until you reach the final torque. And for the heat shield, they're E10s and they get torqued to 71 inch-pounds. Next is to reroute the harness. It's mostly routed in the correct position, but at this point what you'll do is you'll go ahead and reconnect everything that was disconnected. So, cam sensors, phasers, the thermostat housing, the boost control solenoid, and the ground that's over here, this right here, don't forget that. the coolant temperature sensor on the water outlet right there, the barometric sensor right here, and when we get to the coils we'll do that. And don't forget to clip the harness into place right here. Quick side note on the ground bolt, that gets torqued to 71 inch-pounds. That's an E10. And these two are a T30. They get torqued to 71 inch-pounds as well. One thing I didn't mention was also don't forget about the oxygen sensor. Connect that. And now we can go ahead and insert the dipstick. So just a few parts left. Now we're getting down to the PCV hose. Next up is the air box. And don't forget to connect the mass airflow sensor. Alright, so I just connected the battery cable back. That was the last thing that you need to do here. And we're ready for the big moment. So don't forget to add coolant. I know I didn't explain that, but I need to flush the cooling system on this, so I have a couple hoses disconnected and I'm not going to fill it right now. But I just want to make sure that it runs and that I don't have to do anything else before I get to that point. So let's give it a try. Now we start it. No immediate check engine light, so that's good. There's quite a bit of ticking. I didn't soak the lifters in oil before I reinstalled them, which I should have, but that noise should go away after a few minutes, maybe 1 or 2 heat cycles even. And the initial noise on startup, I don't know if you remember, but the oil filter housing was completely empty when I took it off, so we had to reprime that whole oil filter before it could get oil to the timing chain tensioner, so there was a bit of chain rattle there. But running very smooth, no more puffing out the cooling system, so we'll pick back up once the cooling system is all cleaned up. And that oil, that smoke, that's just oil from the new turbo. It was covered in oil. So here's my method for flushing the cooling system. Basically, this rear heater hose that comes out of the water outlet, that goes through the heater core. I've got the garden hose hooked to it. Through the heater core, around to the inlet side of the water pump, and then it goes through the water pump, and it goes through the head, through the block, and comes out this water outlet here. I've got that heater hose disconnected and this radiator hose section disconnected, but what this does is it both flushes the block, the head, the engine oil cooler, because it flows through that as well, and the heater core. So I think it's a pretty good method. Alright, well, here's the car after running for about 20 to 30 minutes. You can hear that those lifters finally fighting down. And it's running nice and smooth and quiet. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. I hope that I made it as structured and understandable as possible. I know I went a lot faster through the reinstallation process, but since you already had the experience disassembling it, putting it back together should have seemed pretty natural. You should know what sockets to use, etc. All I shared was the torque specs and a logical order to do it in. So if this video helped you, like it, leave me a comment if you have any suggestions. And if you want more stuff like this, I post videos like this a lot, so you can subscribe to see more of that. So I hope this is helpful, and thank you again.